next, from Des Moines, Iowa, a Republican presidential candidates debate, sponsored by the Des Moines Register.
Good evening. Welcome to the Iowa presidential debate sponsored by the Des Moines Register. I'm James P. Gannon, editor of the Register, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's debate. 1 month from tonight, the people of Iowa will begin the process of selecting the next president of the United States. On the evening of February 8, they will gather in 2,500 local meetings called precinct caucuses, which will be held in town halls and school buildings and living rooms all across the state. In these meetings, they're going to gather with their neighbors to debate the merits of these candidates and to divide into groups supporting each candidate. The winner in this exercise of grassroots democracy will receive a powerful boost toward his party's presidential nomination. We're meeting here tonight on the stage of the Civic Center in Des Moines, Iowa, and with us this evening are the 6 leading candidates for the Republican presidential nomination. A week from tonight, we'll meet here again with the debate among the Democratic candidates. Our participants here tonight are Robert Dole, Senator from Kansas and Republican leader. Next, General Alexander Haig, former Secretary of State. Jack Kemp, Congressman from New York. Pat Robertson, who has devoted his career to the Christian ministry. George Bush, Vice President of the United States. And finally, Pete DuPont, the former governor of Delaware. Before we begin, a few words about the rules and format for this evening. This debate will consist of 4 segments. To begin tonight's discussion, I will ask one question of each of the candidates. Then we will have a period in which the candidates will question each other. Following that, the candidates will discuss issues that will be raised by our guest questioner from the Democratic Party, whom I will introduce later. And finally, we will finish with closing statements from each of the candidates. The order of the questioning in all parts of this debate has been determined by a drawing of lots. I will begin with Mr. Dole, who drew the first question. Mr. Dole, in your 27 years in Congress, you've proven yourself as a legislator and as a leader of legislators. But being an effective president calls for more than an ability to deal with Congress. It calls for rallying the American people behind a well-defined set of national goals. In Congress, you react to the agenda. In the White House, you have to set the agenda. Do you know where you want to lead this nation? Can you outline in specific terms the Dole administration policy, foreign policy, and domestic policy that will be your hallmark?
Well, first, Jim, thank you very much for hosting this debate. Secondly, I think you understand that we all have our strengths and our weaknesses, and I think I would bring to the White House, in addition to 27 years of congressional experience, traditional small-town values, plus the Washington experience. I would also bring to the White House experience with real people, understanding the problems of people who've made it the hard way, understanding the problems of real people who have problems. Maybe they're disabled, maybe they're black, maybe they're white, maybe they're brown, but they have problems. In some cases, there's no other resort than to turn to the federal government. But I think in the final analysis, the American people are looking for someone who can make a difference. They want moral leadership in the White House. They want political leadership in the White House. They want someone who's a hands-on president and someone who understands the Congress, someone who can work with Democrats and Republicans. So I see it as a transition from the legislative branch to the executive branch, and one that I think I could do very well.
But what are the goals?
That's where I want to go. And when the year 2000 rolls around, it would be my goal, after 2 terms as president, wouldn't quite be at the year 2000, but after that every child who wanted an education in America would have that opportunity. That every man, woman, or child who wanted a job in America would have that opportunity. That every senior citizen who yearns for long-term health care or have no assets of their own would have a program to assure that. That every farmer and every farm family knew they would make it in the marketplace. And finally, that we had long-term foreign policy goals, and we could be assured when the year 2000 rolled around that we'd be living in peace, and peace with security, peace with freedom, and America would be a better place to live because of Bob Dole's leadership as president.
General Haig, you have served in high positions, both civilian and military, under Presidents Nixon and Ford and Reagan. What serious mistakes did you see those presidents make, and what have you learned from those mistakes that would shape your approach to the presidency?
Well, Jim, each president is very, very different. Different chemically, different in their style and their methodology of leadership. I think one of the greatest dangers in modern statecraft and governorship is classic populism. And that's a tendency for a president to get up every morning and put his finger to the wind to determine what is going to make him high in the polls and popular. I think the American people are too smart and to pander to a leader because he's chasing their day-to-day whims. They want the solution to real problems today. And the presidents that I have known that have been most successful have recognized that in the long run, the confidence and trust that they enjoy from the people is a direct measure of his ability to solve their problems. Today, our problems are replete here at home with the challenges of drugs, of law and order, of AIDS, of the declining quality in American education, problems in our farm, our rust bucket, and our energy sectors, and most importantly, a fiscal and monetary imbalance which threatens not only the quality of life for future generations in America, but the standard of living very, very soon in the near future. And above all, the overarching need to have a president who is engaged day to day, hour by hour with the problems of the people, who's viewed abroad with respect, maybe not love and affection, but respect, as a man who is consistent, reliable, and will conduct himself in accordance with the arrangements that have been arrived at by every American president.
Mr. Kemp, you're known as a man of ideas, a man deeply committed to a conservative philosophy. You're considered the political godfather of supply-side economics, which formed the basis of President Reagan's economic policy. Considering the massive economic deficits, the budget deficits that we've had in the Reagan years, and the collapse of confidence on Wall Street last fall, and a 140-point drop today, and the decline in the dollar, are you absolutely convinced that another 4 years of Reaganomics is the right economic policy for this country?
Well, Jim, first of all, let me thank you as well to be here and for your sponsorship of this event. And in answer to your question, I think it's important to know what the strengths are of the Reagan years and then what the mistakes were. And I don't think there's anybody sitting up here who understands the strengths of the Reagan Revolution better than Jack Kemp, nor understands the mistakes that have been made or the flaws in that revolution and what we need to do for the future. I think cutting tax rates in 1981 was the right thing to do. I think it has had a remarkable impact upon the entrepreneurial climate of this country, It has helped strengthen the dollar. It has helped create 14 million new jobs in 6 years. That's more new jobs in the United States of America in 6 years than the continent of Europe has been able to create probably in the last 2 decades. I saw yesterday in the newspapers, in your own newspaper, the unemployment rate has dropped to 5.8%. Inflation is still low. Do we have problems? You bet. And getting busy to solve those problems, I think, is going to take not only talking about leadership, but knowing what has to be done.
What about the deficit?
The deficit is not a revenue problem. Jim, I think it should be obvious to even the critics that revenues today in America are 62% higher for our country than they were when the Kemp-Roth bill was passed in 1981. What's happened is we've had a very liberal Democratic Congress, and spending has risen by 75%. And I think the answer is to have the type of comprehensive economic policy that would put a lid on spending, give a president, and I would be willing to give a Democrat or Republican president a line item veto, get our dollar stabilized. We need to return integrity to the dollar, get interest rates down. I would cut the capital gains tax right now in half, down to 15%, and I'm convinced that with the next 4 to 8 years can be even better than the last, and we can have budget equilibrium as this economy comes to full employment without inflation for all men and women in this country.
Thank you. Mr. Robertson, you've stressed your Christian beliefs and your Christian values in your presidential campaign. In choosing your cabinet and top White House advisors, would it be important to you that they share your Christian values and beliefs? And would those same standards apply in your selection of federal judges?
Well, Jim, as you know, the Constitution makes it very clear that there should be no religious test for any office or position of trust under the United States. And as president, I would swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. So there could be no religious test whatsoever. But I have made it very clear that I'm a conservative. I adopt a conservative philosophy, and I've promised people around this country that as the next president, I would select advisors, key cabinet officials, and the 3,000 to 4,000 positions that are available to me to be filled by conservatives, those who share the same philosophical point of view. But I also have an absolute commitment to put in top cabinet positions women, blacks, Hispanics, possibly Asiatics, and especially business people who have a new grasp of what is needed in this government. But I think we should have unity and harmony in the government. I don't think at the center of our government process should we have a debate. I think that we should have people who share basically the same philosophical concept, and those concepts to me are free enterprise and a strong defense of freedom. I think that we must be committed to the premise that the United States is to be the preeminent power in the world, and that we cannot take a second-rate status in the world. We have to be committed to jobs, to moving the economy into new creative vistas. I want to see people who are technologically creative so that we can begin to take advantage of the enormous opportunities before us. But I do want people who are family people, who believe in the traditional moral values, people who uphold the same basic concept of ordered liberty that our founding fathers had.
Mr. Bush, you've been vice president for 7 years, but it is hard to assess your role in the Reagan administration, what your judgment was on key issues, and what role you played in shaping policy. You've refused to give a full explanation of your role of the sale of arms to Iran and the diversion of money to the Contras. You seem to be telling the American people, in effect, trust me, I did the right thing, but I can't tell you what I did. How can you expect their trust if you won't tell them plainly what you thought, what you said, what you did at that time on those key issues?
Jim, contrary to the hypothesis of your question, I have answered every question put to me save one. And the one question is, what do you tell the President of the United States? And I shouldn't do that. Al didn't go out talking about what he told the President in the depths of Watergate. Bob didn't do it when he was national chairman. I didn't do it, and I'm not going to. You got a problem
between the confidentiality between the president and the vice president that should remain solid. Now, I've answered every question, and I will continue to. And what I'd like to do tonight, since your paper had a full page on this suggesting that I didn't answer a question about diversion, is to ask you now to have each one of these who have been shooting at me to ask the question and let me answer it. Save the one. You asked about diversion. I didn't know about diversion of funds to the Contras. The Congress had an $8 or $10 million hearing. They never suggested that I did. The Tower report said that I didn't. And you, your paper today, had that question raised as if I hadn't answered it. And I resent it, frankly. And I think that you owe me now. You owe it to me. You owe it to me to ask me the question that I haven't answered. You owe me in fairness to answer me the question. Now, what is it?
I want to ask you the question that I haven't heard you answer. George Bush went to Congress and he says what he told the president. He said, to Mr. President, this is a bad policy, we shouldn't do it. Cap Weinberger told the Congress that. They aren't disloyal to the administration. Why can't you?
Told the Congress what?
Told the president.
Said that they told the Congress that they told the president this was a bad policy, they were opposed to it.
I supported the policy. I stood, as Poindexter said, solidly for the policy. And the policy was saying, look, we got to do better. We got to look over the horizon to see if there isn't something that we can deal with in the interest of this Persian Gulf, in the interest of U.S.-Iran relations, something better than dealing with this madman, Ayatollah Khomeini. And the other part of it is, and here's where I probably erred, Jim, we were concerned, our head of the CIA, we got reports that Mr. Buckley, now admitted as the CIA station chief, was being tortured. The president and the vice president, certainly the president, bear the burden of that more than anybody else. And if we erred, and I think we did, in retrospect, looking back, a deal that wasn't supposed to be arms for hostages proved to be that, but if we erred on the side of trying to free Americans that are held by terrorists. And yes, I'm sorry that things didn't work out right, that it was proved later to be arms for hostages, but the president was presented a deal that wasn't arms for hostages. He made a tough choice. He had some concerns about it. I had some concerns about it. They have been recorded, and I don't think it is very fair to say I've refused to respond to questions.
Well, I think we'll probably have more questions. I think we'll probably have more questions on this as we go along. But it's time for a question for Mr. DuPont.
Great.
I don't want to leave you alone out there. Mr. DuPont, you're from a famous and wealthy family. You've attended the best schools. You've never really had to worry about finding a job. With this background, do you really understand what life is like for the average American? Can you point to things in your own record, as governor or in other positions, where you demonstrated concern, understanding for the less fortunate in society, and where would those concerns fit into your administration as president?
Well, Jim, the voters of this country have to make a decision about the character and integrity and beliefs of the man or woman they elect president of the United States, and all I can do is offer them the evidence. I do come from a family that I'm very proud of. My people came here on the first day of a new century, January 1st, 1800. They didn't speak English, they didn't have homes, they didn't have jobs, and they went to work and they built a family business, and I'd like to see every family in America have the opportunity that Pierre Samuel DuPont and Eleuthère Irénée DuPont had in January of 1800. I believe that the evidence in my record will say to the American people, here's somebody who not only understands but helped. 25% of the welfare mothers in Delaware got off the rolls while I was governor because of our economic policies. The Congress and the Democratic Congress has had a welfare policy that is trapping mothers in poverty. And our campaign proposes to replace welfare with work to give those mothers a chance, the same kind of chance they had in Delaware. Every Delaware family had a 30% tax cut while I was governor. 20% more jobs existed in the state on the day that I left office than the day I arrived. That's pretty good opportunity. That's pretty good understanding. This campaign is about kitchen table issues like lower taxes and more jobs. And what we should be doing tonight, and we appreciate the opportunity, is addressing ourselves to families in Iowa and all over America. How can we steer your kids away from drugs and towards opportunity? How can we take care of you better in your retirement? How can we make sure your youngsters get a good education? How can we make sure America stays free? Those are the questions for the campaign of 1988, and I'm ready to answer.
That completes the opening round of questions. It's time now for the candidates to question each other. Each of the candidates has drawn the names of 3 of his rivals to question. The first question now is Mr. Haig questioning Mr. Dole.
Bob, you've established a very impressive record of leadership in our legislature. But in recent years, the great dilemma of the United States is the inability of the Congress and the executive branch to work together in an effective foreign policy that represents a partnership of responsibility. I have no more urgent task than to recreate such a partnership. If you were to be president, how would you deal with this vexing question?
Well, Al, first, I think you're exactly right. I mean, we don't have a bipartisan foreign policy. We've seen what's happened in the Persian Gulf in the early votes. We've seen what's happened in Nicaragua, to Afghanistan to some extent. And we need to restore a bipartisan foreign policy. Now, how would Bob Dole address it? First, I think I would go there with strength and ability in dealing with Congress. That's my business. I do it every day. I've been the majority leader. And running the Congress is like running any business that I know with 100, the last time I counted, 100 prima donnas in the Senate. Can't speak for the House, Jack, but in the Senate.
Thank you.
And I've been the Republican leader of the Senate. And I think I would bring to the Oval Office the understanding and the desire to work with the Congress for a bipartisan foreign policy. I'll give you one good example. We've been arguing for months last year over the ABM treaty, whether there ought to be a narrow or a broad interpretation. That should have been a matter of negotiation between Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. But the Congress did it to President Reagan. They took away that chip. Now they're suggesting we can only do certain things with SDI, and that was part of the ABM debate. We've in effect handed Ortega a partial victory by refusing to appropriate money for freedom fighters. There's no doubt in my mind what this country needs is strong leadership, a strong president, someone who understands the Congress and knows the players and can go to the Congress, go to the leadership, and the first thing I would do in 1989 after taking the oath of office, one of the first things, first have to deal with the deficit, is to sit down with the leadership in the Congress in both parties and talk about restoring bipartisanship in foreign policy. It's our country. It's not a democratic country, Republican country, an independent country. It's our country. It's America's country, the people's country. And I want to work at it.
Mr. Kemp, you have a question for the Vice President.
I do. Mr. Vice President, about a month ago on the NBC debate when Tom Brokaw had us all at the Kennedy Center, I suggested that there had to be a plan in place to stabilize the dollar, to guarantee once again that interest rates can come down because there's long-term confidence in the dollar. And I asked you whether or not you would support defending the dollar, and you said no. Recently, the administration has begun to defend the dollar. I wonder if your position has changed since then.
Jack, what I thought I said was that I wouldn't support a plan that pegged the dollar to a specific rate. In other words, set the dollar-yen rate at 122 yen to the dollar or something of that nature. And I don't want to do that, and I wouldn't do it. I don't think that's the administration's plan, and if it is, I wouldn't do that as President of the United States. What I think we've got to do is address ourselves, and Bob hit it on the head, to the first fundamental we can do something about, and that's the deficit, because that does affect interest rates. It does affect confidence in our country. And I tried to say how I'd go about it, same way as you holding the line on taxes. I think the time has come to take the case to the American people to reverse the flow of power away from the White House up to the Congress, and to get the Congress to give the President the line item veto. And I believe that would really help get the deficit under control. And of course you have to keep an adequate supply of money, monetary policy. You have to encourage, and you can't force them to do this, countries like Japan and Germany to grow so they can do a better job of purchasing our goods. But no, I don't favor fixing the rates of the dollar, the yen, and the Deutschmark, or whatever it is. I don't favor pegging those rates.
Mr. DuPont, you have a question for Mr. Robertson.
Pat, because we have no competition in our education system, according to the University of Northern Iowa's recent study, American schools are now about the 10th best in the world. The Teachers Union and the Democratic Party would like to keep it that way. They don't want to change anything. I believe that parents should have a choice in where their children go to school through a voucher that they can use in a public school or a private school or a parochial school, because that'll help parents match up students with better education. What do you believe?
Well, Pete, as you know, education is my specialty. I started a graduate level university and have been recently, in the last 3 years, helped train 123,000 children and adults how to read and write. We have an appalling problem of illiteracy. 29 million functional illiterates in the United States, and we have the risk of being like a banana republic by the middle of the next century unless something's done about it. I think the voucher system absolutely will introduce free enterprise competition into the school system. Now, the federal government, I talked to Bill Bennett several years ago about that we could put that in for the poor so long as it wasn't a vehicle of discrimination. And I think that the children should be allowed to go to where the best school system is. Now, the states would have to do that on the state level, but I would like to see it put into effect all over the school system. But beyond that, we need to move our school system back to basics. We're not teaching the children the facts of math, the facts of geography, or the facts of history. We're becoming both functionally illiterate, which means they can't read and write, but it also seems that we're becoming culturally illiterate. 25% of the kids can't identify where the United States is on a map. We surveyed some students at the University of Maryland, and we asked one student, could you tell us what 3 countries the United States fought in World War II? They said, yes, we fought Korea, we fought Pearl Harbor, and we fought the Spanish. Now, if this is the level of college instruction, we have a serious problem that has to be addressed beginning in the elementary grades all the way through. I would like to zero base the $19 billion of money that's being spent by the federal government, and I'm particularly interested in seeing a model project. Take a state, whatever the 50th state in education is, let's spend a couple $100 million to put on the best system of education we can in that state and use it as a model for the rest of the nation, if the state would be willing to do so.
Mr. Bush, you have a question for Mr. DuPont.
Pete, last time we met, you weren't ready to support the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the one that does have widespread support. I think, in fairness, you had not seen the verification provisions of the treaty. I think it's a great step for peace. It's not perfect. A lot else we need to do. But do you now support this treaty? If you had to vote today, would you vote yes or no if it came up just as it was handed to the Senate?
I'd vote no, George, and I don't support it for the reason that I suggested a couple of times ago. Peace is important, but it's nowhere nearly as important as freedom. I think that treaty, by removing the biggest deterrent to the Soviet army in Europe, our intermediate range missiles, by leaving behind the greatest threat to freedom in Western Europe, that enormous Soviet military establishment, I think that treaty makes the defense of freedom in Western Europe more difficult and not less difficult. And that's why I'd not support it. Yes, it's supposed to be verifiable and will tell us, and we'll be able to tell if the Russians cheat. We know they cheat. They cheated on the ABM Treaty. We didn't do anything about it. They cheated on the Helsinki Accords. We didn't do anything about it. They cheated on the agreements for free elections in Poland in 1946, and we didn't do anything about it. President Reagan said the other day that he thought the Soviet Union had changed and wasn't an expansionist, aggressive power anymore. I think he's dead wrong. I don't think the Soviets have changed. We haven't seen any evidence in Nicaragua. We haven't seen any evidence in Afghanistan. We haven't seen any evidence in the emigration of Soviet Jews. I don't believe that the communists have suddenly become non-communists. And I don't think that treaty is going to advance the cause of freedom. And I worry even more about what comes next. And I know that you're eager to get on with the next treaty to limit intercontinental missiles. I'd like to see the Soviets fulfill a commitment to an existing treaty before we march down the road hand in hand to additional treaties.
Mr. Dole, it's your turn now. Question for Mr. Haig.
You know, Al, one of the big problems we have, and it was touched on in the exchange between Jim and George Bush, is terrorism, international terrorism. You came very close one time to being caught up in it yourself, losing your life, in effect. And whether it's arms for hostages or arms at all to Iran, which I think would be a mistake, we have to deal with international terrorism. You've got the expertise, you've had the experience. Give me a good way I can do that when I become president.
Well, first, Bob, there's no question we've had a little political terrorism here tonight, thanks to Jim.
Zing.
But
Zing.
I think it's important, first and foremost, to, when confronted with a terrorist outrage, to know whether or not it's the mindless act of a splinter group seeking social justice or the product of state sponsorship which seeks political change. Now, if that's our determination, and that's the kind of terrorism we've been involved with primarily in the Middle East, then we have to take action. Now, in the early part of the administration, I think that action was less than effective. First, we tended to ask ourselves, when confronted with a terrorist outrage, how our reaction would be received by the American people rather than how it would be received by the perpetrator of that crime. That must be our first consideration. Secondly, we tended to camouflage the known involvement of a terrorist government, as we did the involvement of Syria in the destruction of our embassy in West Beirut, only to be followed by the murder of hundreds of American brave young Marine peacekeepers. And then we withdrew with our tail between our legs and gave Syria and terrorism a victory. It was Maggie Thatcher who had to have the courage to call Syria to the table to account for itself. Finally, if, God forbid, there is no other solution but a resort to military power, then by heavens, you must use that power in a way that the perpetrator of that crime will never want to receive it again. We failed in the first attack on Libya. That first attack on Libya was a disgrace. It meant clearly there must be another. So I would offer those observations.
Thank you. Mr. Robertson, your turn to pose a question for Mr. Kemp.
Jack, I know your interest in monetary policy and a sound dollar, gold standard, and fiscal integrity, and you've talked about returning us to some post-Bretton Woods understanding. Could you tell us how we get there, and how can we maintain in the system enough liquidity and an expanding liquidity while at the same time we put on something like a gold standard? Can that be done?
Well, Pat, I think the most serious problem facing this country right now, and most likely the world, is for the first time in our adult lifetime, there is no standard for any currency anywhere on this earth. The floating exchange rate system that the Vice President just defended has caused international markets to be dislocated, caused farmers in Iowa to be unable to compete with other currencies that are being manipulated against our currency. We've lost markets for corn, soybean, cotton, widgets, and lots of manufactured products beyond that. Seems to me we need a new, modernized, international and domestic monetary system in which, once again, the dollar is one of integrity, confidence, trustworthiness, and one in which our interest rates can come down here and around the world. I noticed the other day that in the Des Moines Register, farmland values are beginning to recover in Iowa. I think they're up by 11% on average throughout the state of Iowa. We would never have had that type of a deflationary experience where farm prices, farmland values, exports, and lots of problems in the commodity-based industries from Texas to Oklahoma throughout the Midwest would have occurred had it not been for the fact that we had a central bank that absolutely raised interest rates to inordinately high rates, higher than the Civil War, in trying to pay off debt, and getting interest rates down to normal long-term levels, I'd say 3 or 4%, bringing mortgage rates down to 5 or 5.5%, is essential to the American dream, to a recovery of commodity prices, to export markets for farmers and manufacturers, and getting the world economy growing again and helping third world countries pay off debt so they can begin to buy something from Iowa, not just use all their earnings to pay off debt to New York City banks. So I would definitely, as soon as I were elected President, Pat, bring the industrial nations of the world together to restore an international monetary regime with sound money at the center of that system and make the dollar as good as gold to return interest rates to 3 or 4%.
Thank you. Mr. Hague, it's your turn to question Mr. Robertson.
Right. We've already, Pat, touched upon the INF Treaty, and certainly one of the potential flaws of it is the great burden we're putting on our conventional defenses in Europe, which are somewhat less than satisfactory. Today, we find ourselves engaged in a controversy with an old friend, Spain, which is seeking to expel the American air squadrons from Torrejon Air Base. Do you believe this is a significant challenge to our leadership, and if so, what would you do about it as president?
I think that our allies owe us the respect that our position in the world deserves, and some gratitude for all that we've done in the past for them, particularly Spain and other nations in Europe. And I know it's popular in local politicians to sort of tweak the nose of Uncle Sam and to do so with impunity. But we need the bases in Spain, just like we need the bases in the Philippines, particularly in the Far East. We can't get away without having those bases. It's absolutely essential to the security of the free world that those bases be maintained, and I don't think that we should hold still for what amounts to exorbitant ransom for what we're doing for them. We are defending their interests against communism. We're defending their freedom. And it seems like to me we should insist in our diplomacy that they accord us the courtesy we need. Now, I've got a little more time, and you did mention the INF Treaty, and I think we might say a couple of words about that in addition. There are 3 standards that arms control should adhere to since 1970. One is that any arms control agreement would reduce the likelihood of war. The second is that there would be a definite reduction in nuclear arms. And thirdly, that there would not be additional expenses for conventional weapons. The current INF Treaty, regretfully, violates all 3 of those tenets. Number one, by taking out the Pershing missiles of Europe, we might well enhance the possibility of war and bring ourselves to an ICBM situation where bombs are falling in the mainland of America. The second problem we are running into is that the treaty specifically has to do only with missiles. It does not have to do with warheads. We are not reducing one single nuclear weapon. And the third thing is we might have to spend $50 to $100 billion more a year in conventional forces in the United States and in NATO. And I think if anybody reads that treaty carefully, they'll find that we aren't reducing nuclear arms at all, and that's a great problem with that INF Treaty.
Mr. DuPont, your turn to question the Vice President.
George, every family in America is paying about $400 a year to fund the agricultural subsidy system we have in this country. In addition, taxpayers are paying money to subsidize grain sales to communist Russia at below market prices. I believe we ought to stop subsidizing grain sales to the Soviet Union and phase out farm subsidies, and Bob Dole believes just the opposite.
No, not
Which
really.
do you believe?
I think on that I'd stand with Bob. The reason, Pete, is I don't think you can just go cold turkey and cut off the farmers from supports. Agricultural economy is just coming back. But what I do is work diligently to expand our sales abroad. I'm a great believer in alternative uses of energy. We can use a lot more ethanol in this country, and that'll solve the environmental problems of Denver and Houston and other cities. And then we've got to do more in terms of rural redevelopment. But the idea that we should get rid of our export enhancement program, or that we should be afraid of selling under conditions that exist now under this farm bill, I'm sorry, I support the present farm bill. I'm glad it's working. And yes, I favor much more application of market, but we can't do it unless we can have a successful round of negotiations with our trading partners and get what we deserve, more open access to their markets. And if we can do that, then we can have that goal of turning agriculture into a pure market economy. But I don't support your plan, and I would stand closer to Bob Dole on that one.
Mr. Bush, it's your turn now. You have a question for Mr. Haig.
Al, I'm deeply concerned about AIDS. I mentioned, talked the other day with a Surgeon General, with a priest from San Francisco. I favor testing, confidentiality. I favor using the bully pulpit, speaking out against promiscuous lifestyle, favor monogamous relationship. I favor compassion and caring. Family that loses a kid from AIDS, it's a humiliation and it's a scary thing, and they feel awful alone. What would you do in terms of an AIDS policy?
Well, I've already touched upon it as a major challenge for our next president. And I must admit to being a little disturbed about the sterile argument within conservative circles. On the one hand, that it's strictly a moral question, and on the other hand, that it's simply a technical medical question. It is both. Clearly, it is both. And it must be dealt with a balance of both. It seems to me that the family, the school, the church, the bully pulpit of the president must focus on abstinence before marriage and fidelity after marriage. That's an essential aspect of our approach. But there are also technical medical issues that have to be dealt with a greater sense of urgency. This new budget just passed is about $1 billion for aid research in America. This is an international problem. It demands international leadership, which long since should have been taken by the United States of America, to convene all of the developing and developed nations in a forum in which our experiences, our research and development talents, and our resources are pooled to meet this as a global international problem. It means, of course, there must be testing in certain special cases with due care to confidentiality, and new technologies, I am confident, can already provide that. That would involve certainly immigration. We've already picked up a number of cases from the Caribbean immigration. It would involve certainly in our prisons a forced environment. No one said that a prison sentence must be a death sentence. So we have to test and segregate. And I think as this crisis develops and we look at confidentiality and the assurance of it, that even perhaps marriage licenses would fit. But this is a problem that must be dealt with a greater sense of urgency.
Mr. Robertson, your turn to question Mr. DuPont.
We've discussed on previous debates the whole concept of care for the elderly, and I am 100% for a system which cares for our elderly and especially long-term health care. But you have observed, as I have, that by the year 2015, the younger workers in America might be shortchanged under the existing Social Security system. And you have observed the enormous increase in Social Security taxes. Mr. Bush said to you that that was a nutty idea. Would you like to comment on whether it's nutty or not?
Well, George still doesn't understand. But I'm not going to waste time on him. The last poll that was taken, Pat, showed that 69% of the people in America are worried about whether their Social Security benefits are ever going to be paid to them in full. And well, they should worry, because Social Security, while it does work for the 34 million Americans who are getting benefits today, is going to face a problem when 77 million baby boomers retire. I think we need to guarantee that Social Security system so that Congress cannot cut the benefits again, so we don't create more notch babies who are being robbed because of what the Congress did in 1977 of some of their retirement benefits. I believe that we want to stop the continual escalation of taxes, and just this week, Social Security taxes went up. Think of the fellow out in Bob Dole country, a small rural town, maybe an agribusiness who's self-employed. That man or that woman pays 15%, all paid himself, no company to pay the other half for him. That's a heavy tax, particularly on a young person who wants to get into business. I think there's a better way than constantly raising taxes, perhaps doubling taxes on our children and our grandchildren to meet the retirement needs of the baby boomers, and that's to allow, as you've heard me say before, some super IRAs, some independent savings accounts that one controls oneself. You invest in it, you insure it, you put it in Treasury bills, you watch it grow. It avoids taxing our kids at double the current rate. It creates a pool of savings for America, gives us financial independence, and maybe twice the income that Social Security ever would. And I would say to my friend George Bush again, that's as far as you can get from a dumb and nutty idea as I can think of.
You have a question now for Mr. Dole.
Yeah, Bob, you and I have had some friendly disagreements over the years on taxes, and it's awfully cold out there in the streets, and I come from Buffalo, you come from Lawrence, Kansas, and
Russell.
Russell, excuse me. It's cold throughout Kansas, and I know it's cold tonight in Buffalo, New York. I'll tell you where I come from. Let me ask you a question. Why impose on the American economy an oil import fee? Do you still believe that we need an oil import fee to get the deficit down?
Well, Jack, as you know, I've said that under certain conditions I would support an oil import fee. I've been an advocate, but I said I'd ask the question. I gave an honest answer. And I think there are 3 or 4 basic reasons. I don't want you to be cold in Buffalo.
Thank you, Bob.
And, you know, I don't want to be cold in Des Moines either. But right now we're importing about 42% of our oil needs. Right now, I don't know how many thousand oil rigs are stacked and how many thousands and thousands of people are out of work in the so-called oil patch. An oil import fee would do some positive things. I know you're concerned about taxes. I don't want to raise tax rates either. But it would bring price stability. It would send a strong signal to OPEC. It would mean more conservation. And obviously, if we had an oil import fee, you raise about $1 billion for every dollar. If you had a $5 a barrel, you'd raise $5 billion. So you'd have some revenue. You'd have to rebate probably most of that to those who use heating oil in New England, particularly in those early states like New Hampshire. And but I just think, Jack,
where do you raise the money, Bob?
Well, the money's going to come from the fee, and then you're going to have a rebate system to take care of that, take care of those low-income Americans. And finally, what you could do with this, Jack, and you ought to think about it, might join together.
Well, it's a shell game so far, but go ahead.
The best part is coming. But let me just say this. One thing we could do with the revenue we raise from the oil import fee is to fill SPRO, our Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is now about 500 million barrels, which is not adequate enough. We need more oil in that reserve. So I think on balance, if we have to find revenue somewhere to reduce the deficit, in addition to all the spending restraint we want, this wouldn't be a bad way to go.
Mr. Dole, you can turn the tables now and have a question at Mr. Kemp.
Jack, I was going to ask Jack about AIDS, and I may do that because I think it's good that George raised it. I've said from the start that this should not be a political issue. This is going to be a problem one of us are going to have to address because one of us is going to be elected. So it's going to be that way. I meant to exclude Jim.
I'll clap for that.
But I'll say to Jack Kemp's credit, he's done a lot of work in this area. He made a very extensive study of AIDS and things we ought to do about it. And I think Jack understands there are three areas we have to address. Confidentiality, who has the right to know. Testing, who should be tested, what the federal government role should be. And anti-discrimination. What happens when you have it about your job or whatever? Maybe you could just address that question.
Well, we need one more thing. We need to bring the public health authorities into the fight against AIDS.
We've got the money.
There has to be contact tracing. And with all due respect, it has to be confidential. But we've got to bring the public health authorities into this battle, and it's got to be done through contact tracing. Education, we've got to spend money for research. We've got to have a value-based education, as I think all of us agree. We've got to teach young people that there's right and wrong and truth and error and good and evil, and that there are Judeo-Christian values, and they have to even be we have to even be willing to suggest to our young people that this country was based upon those values, and we shouldn't let the public schools get away from the idea that there are eternal truths upon which you can make both a country and your own personal life and your family a lot better off. I don't think we ought to shy away from putting the Ten Commandments up on bulletin boards, notwithstanding the fact that the Supreme Court said that that's a violation of the separation of church and state. Having said that, I think the combination of education, spending for research, confidentiality and contact tracing, and a strong program of testing, routine testing, is essential. And Bob, it is a political issue. We shouldn't be politicized.
That's what I mean.
Demagogue, but it is a political issue because we're running for the office upon which alone we can make that decision to help wipe this scourge out, as Franklin Roosevelt wiped out a sexually transmitted disease in the 1930s with a strong program of education, contact tracing, and public health authorities. So I believe we can do it. We ought to do it. We ought to let the American people know that we pledge to them we're going to put an end to the AIDS virus in our immediate lifetime.
We've now completed 2 rounds of the candidate cross-questioning, and we have 1 more round to go. And in this final round, we'll be limiting the answers to 1 minute in order to keep on time here. So we begin now with Mr. DuPont, who has a question for Senator Dole.
You know, Bob, you and Jack are so good at discussing oil import fees. I'd like to see you stay right in the Congress and handle those questions for me when I'm down at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. But I think it's important that we understand where the next president of the United States thinks about the Soviet Union. And as I said a moment ago to George, President Reagan believes the Soviet Union has fundamentally changed. I don't see that. They still cheat on agreements. They still oppress people. They're still aggressive and a threat to the United States. Do you believe the Soviets have changed and abandoned their goal of world communism? Or do you think they're still the aggressive nation that they seem to be?
I'd answer part A, no, and the last part, yes.
That'll save some time. We can go to the next question.
But I just follow up very briefly, because I know we've got a time problem. You know, I said when Mr. Gorbachev was here, when he left, you know, I don't trust Gorbachev. I didn't say that in any hostile way. He doesn't trust us either. We shouldn't make any deal with the Soviet Union that's not in our interest. And that's what Ronald Reagan did with the INF Treaty. It's in our interest. They're not going to make any deal that's not in their interest. So as long as we keep it on that plane, then we have to have the dialogue. We're superpowers. We have to talk to each other. And we need to find the strongest leader we can to sit across from Gorbachev in 1989. And since you won't be there, maybe I can do it for both of us. So,
That'd put the second strongest person
well,
there.
that's true. But it just seems to me that we've got a lot of work to do. We're not going to trust the Soviet Union. We're going to do it in our interest. And when the INF, the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty hearings start on January 25th, I'll be there supporting the President, as I have in nearly every case in the past.
Mr. Vice President, your turn to question Mr. Kemp.
Jack, I oppose an oil import fee. The oil patch is divided. Bob knows
Right,
that.
they're about
Half or four. The reason I do, I was in the business and I found the regulations and it also raised taxes. It would raise the price of fuel to farmers in Iowa very much. That's why I oppose it. I favor re-incenting through the tax system the oil industry. We've got to do more. We can't become more dependent on foreign oil. I want to repeal the windfall profits tax, deregulate natural gas, and I'd also like to open up the tax system for future incentive. Now, do you agree with that approach?
Well, I'd take it a step further, George, and ask you why, as Vice President for 8 years in the Reagan administration, you haven't repealed the oil windfall tax, you haven't decontrolled natural gas, and you haven't added the incentives.
Hey, listen, we've sent up stuff to get it.
Let me just finish
No.
And if it hadn't been for Jack Kemp and the 1986 tax law, the administration with Jim Baker as Secretary of Treasury, your appointment, would have wiped out incentives for the oil and gas industry. So you're kind of preaching to the choir when you talk to Jack Kemp about incentives for production, not only for farmers, but for oil and gas. And I am convinced that if we are to save and have a strong, independent, secure energy industry for America, we've got to go further and expand the oil depletion allowance and expand incentives for drilling and expand the geological formations that can be written off in order to encourage the production of this very important asset. But I'll tell you what, George, with all due respect, I never would have embraced the Saudis and the idea of trying to raise oil prices through OPEC as you did just a few years ago.
That is a direct charge is wrong. I didn't. I just didn't like $8 oil because I thought that would result in oil lines that stretch, rationing lines that stretch from Des Moines to Houston, and everyone knows that.
I'm a co-sponsor of Phil Graham's bill.
You had 600 drilling rigs running when you busted the price back to $8. And that shouldn't ever happen to this country again because the national security is at stake.
But asking the Saudis to raise the price of oil,
George, I didn't ask the Saudis to raise the price of oil.
You get to ask another question, but this one goes to Mr. Robertson. It's your turn, Mr. Kemp. Kemp for Mr. Robertson.
I got so excited about my one chance to question the Vice President about suggesting that Texas join OPEC, I couldn't resist. I'm a strong believer, Pat, that senior citizens are not the cause of the deficit. The Social Security system, despite what you and Pete say, is not in long-term problem if we keep inflation down and the economy growing. I kept the Congress from freezing COLAs in 1985 when both George and Bob were for it. What would you have done in 85 on that COLA freeze on Social Security?
Jack, this is a politically tough answer, but I'm going to give it to you anyhow. I would have gone along with Bob Dole in the Senate on that one because I think it was a very, very courageous move in a time when we needed help. And I might also say that I have never, ever wanted in any way, shape, or form to cut back the benefits of senior citizens. But I do know, Jack, that you have involved yourself and others in a $25 billion tax increase. 1988, 1990, the Social Security taxes have gone up, will go up $25 billion. By the year 2015, there won't be enough money for the younger workers. I want to do everything we can to guarantee the integrity of the Social Security system for the elderly, absolutely without question, to provide long-term health care for the senior citizens, and I may add to do something for the notch babies if we can find some play in that. That's a $65 billion 10-year deal, but we want to do that too. But especially, I'm concerned about those young workers at 20, 30, and 40. What's going to happen to them in the year 2015, 2020, and beyond? I want them to have a system that isn't subject to the vagaries of the political process. I want to look care of both, and I think we can do it through a private system.
Senator Dole. Question for Mr. DuPont.
Well, I get to ask you one. Well, first let me just correct a couple of things. You know, Jack Kemp wanted to repeal the oil depletion allowance in one of the first Kemp tax bills. And he also voted against the...
Windfall profit tax, Bob.
No, I think it was depletion allowance. But in any event, we'll get into that later. But I want to ask Pete DuPont a question about the Contras, the freedom fighters. You know, if we don't get more funding from Congress in early February, I think it's about the 4th, what would you suggest we do? If Congress votes down money, the liberals are opposed to it, what would you do for the Contras at that time?
Well, first, we've got to go out as political leaders and work with the American people to change the mind of the Congress of the United States, which is making serious mistakes in not helping the Contras. We have three interests in Central America. The first is to make sure the people of Nicaragua get their civil liberties restored, their radio stations back on the air, their newspapers allowed to publish. Secondly, we want to make sure that that communist Sandinista regime stops undermining freedom in El Salvador, and once they get through there, they'll undermine it in Honduras and Costa Rica, and we don't want that to happen. But third, and most importantly, we don't want communist missiles, MiGs, tanks, submarines, and soldiers 22 hours car drive from Texas. So we have got to persuade the Congress, which is lagging way behind the people of this country, to help get the communists out of Central America and bring freedom to the people of the country of Nicaragua. And as a spokesman, I'd work very hard to get that done.
That's an excellent answer.
Mr. Robertson.
Thank you. Yes.
Your turn. A question for Mr. Haig.
Al, in the press, we have seen some charges and countercharges among the front runners, silkworm missiles flying in Washington and things like that, and a charge of who is the leader. You were Secretary of State and a very good one. You sat in on cabinet meetings. Tell us about the leadership of the Vice President. Was he really the leader that he says, or did the President look to Bob Dole?
Pat, that's a silkworm if I ever saw one. I think confidentiality, that a Secretary of State never tells what advice he gave to the Vice President.
That sounds like a cop-out, not confidential.
More seriously, I don't think it's my role to offer report cards on the Vice President, and I don't think it's his to render any on me either.
That ends our rounds of crossfire among the candidates. We go on now, please. In planning this debate, we wanted to inject a new element. Our idea was to have a leading Democrat give her a chance to question these Republican candidates. And so we turn now to the loyal opposition to test the ideas of these Republican Party contenders. Please join me now in welcoming our Democratic guest questioner, Pat Schroeder of Colorado. Welcome. Tricia Schroeder is a graduate of the University of Minnesota and Harvard Law School and worked as an attorney in Denver before being elected to Congress in 1972. After 17 years, she is the senior woman member of Congress. Mrs. Schroeder serves on the Armed Services Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and the Post Office and Civil Service Committee in the House. She is recognized as an expert on military affairs and foreign affairs, as well as being a leading advocate of women's rights and family issues. She also has ties to Iowa. She graduated from Roosevelt High School right here in Des Moines, and earlier this year she came to Iowa to explore running as a Democratic candidate in the 1988 Iowa caucuses. She decided against running for president, but we're real pleased she can be here with us tonight. Congresswoman, welcome. I yield the floor to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim, and thank all of you. I want to thank the Des Moines Register for having these debates and for asking me to be here. When I was trying to get into the race, the debates that were going on I couldn't get into, and now that I'm out, I'm delighted to be invited in. So it's a little confusing. I also want to thank all the candidates here, because many of them are very special friends of mine, and I know what they're going through. They kind of bring me in as the Democratic pit bull. Let me tell you, I am not the Democratic pit bull. Pit bulls don't cry. And when I think
you.
When I think of what you're going through tonight and with your families and going through this long race, I suddenly realize I shouldn't have cried when I got out. I probably should have cheered. But I thank you, and I thank you for going through this process that we have. And let me get right to the point, because that's what I'm supposed to do. First of all, old Casey Stengel used to say, if we don't know where we're going, we may not get there. So I have been off stage listening to the debate, and one of the things that I have heard mentioned by all the candidates is how very important this deficit is. I think it is a very key and critical thing. We all deplore it. What are we going to do about it? I think that's very critical. When we talk about the $1.3 trillion worth of growth we've had since 1982, the tragedy is we've had $1.3 trillion worth of debt, so it's kind of a wash. When I got up this morning, the paper said that the debt may be $31 billion over the estimate, and tonight we heard the market drop to 140 points. So I think it's very contemporary. So let me start with Mr. DuPont. If you're elected president, you're going to be chief fiscal officer. You're going to bring that budget over to us first. You can put in anything, take out anything you want. As I've also listened to this debate, I've heard that you have an idea on tax-free IRAs, that you would like to do vouchers for schools. Others have mentioned more money for AIDS research, for long-term health care. What are you going to put in, and what are you going to take out to do something other than deplore the debt as chief fiscal officer?
Well, Pat, good question. Let me say, first of all, in this process, I'm not going through anything. I'm loving every minute of this. This is the biggest opportunity I've ever had, and I like the process. It's not a drag. The first thing we know about the deficit is we're not going to try to solve it by raising taxes, because that doesn't work. You all in the Congress have raised taxes 5 times since Ronald Reagan cut them in 1981, and the deficit hasn't gotten any smaller. Didn't get any smaller until last year you limited spending. So we've got to limit spending. Where? By phasing farm subsidies out over 5 years, and that'll take $23 billion off the deficit when that's complete. There are 30 military bases, as you well know, that the Pentagon says we don't need right here in America to defend our freedom. If we closed them, that'd save some $4 billion a year, but the Congress won't allow them to be closed. We ought to give the President a line item veto. He could have used that to take $24 billion out of the highway bill and the clean water bill, the amount they were over budget when you overrode his veto. And finally, a constitutional amendment that says if you want to spend more money than the country has, you in Congress, you have to do it by a 2/3 vote in each house and not a simple majority, and then the deficit problem will begin to be solved.
Well, I would like to have a follow-on to that, but we won't get through, so let me move on, because I think it's important that everybody gets their say. Vice President Bush, you have been very, very prominent in international affairs during the last 7 years. And one of the things President Eisenhower said was the reason we rebuilt our allies was so they would pick up more of the cost of defense. Last year, we subsidized both Japan and European defense at the tune of about $175 billion, which is more than our deficit. Why hasn't the administration been more successful in getting our allies to pick up more of this in the Eisenhower tradition?
I think we can do better on that. I don't know the answer as to why they've been unwilling, but I will point to the Persian Gulf today, and some have the feeling we're doing that heavy lifting all by ourselves. And the Dutch are there, the Belgians are there, the Italians are there, the French are there, the UK is there with a higher percentage of their fleet. So, and I think NATO is probably as strong as it's ever been. And I think our relationship with Japan, who has impediments, as you know, on what it can do militarily because of constitutional constraints. But I think we ought to keep trying, keep working, and get them to do as much as they possibly will. But you and I might differ, because I don't think we ought to do what the previous administration suggested at first, and that is take our troops out of Korea. I don't think so. I think that would risk destabilization of the peninsula and of our major interests in the Pacific. I don't think we ought to pull back out of the Clark Air Force Base or Subic, and I don't think that we ought to take our troops out of draw down on NATO. What I want to do, and a good way to go about it, is to have asymmetrical reductions on conventional forces. If we can get the Russians to do asymmetrically what they did in the INF force, then we'll be able to take some people out. But we shouldn't do it unilaterally. They have us outmanned.
I agree with you there, but I think we also have to point out that they can pay. There's nothing in their Constitution saying they can't pay, and their economies are so booming. We really have to get on that or we'll never touch the debt. Mr. Robinson, I got an interesting question for you.
I bet you do. Go ahead.
I have heard of Keynesian economics, and I've heard of supply-side economics, and I've even heard of voodoo economics. I can't remember where.
Get at it.
But in doing some of my research on these questions on the deficit, I found an interesting statement of yours back in 1982 that I'd like to have you explain. You were asked about the economic problems of the U.S. and how they could be solved, and you came up with something we might call Jubilee economics. You said that one of the ways to do this was to declare a year of Jubilee and cancel the debts. Now, will you let me know when? Because I'd like to build up my visa first, but I'm really wondering what you meant by that.
Pat, you're going to help me win the election because most of the people in this audience are debtors, and so that's a popular thing. Seriously, the trouble that we run into economically, if you use the term Kondratiev long wave cycle, is a cycle of debt accumulation, which we have in our country now, $10 trillion. We have it about every 54, 56, 58 years on an exponential basis. And the last time we had it, 26, we began to see a fall off in the farm economy, then in manufacturing, then a stock market crash, then people in Congress saying we should raise tariff barriers. The Fed began to pull back on the money supply, and the Democrats came in under Franklin Roosevelt saying we ought to raise taxes. We're seeing the exact same cycle all over again precisely. But what we must do is recognize that many of the debts in the third world are uncollectible. In the farm situation, I want to write debts down to the underlying value of the assets that secure those debts, give the farmer in possession a new break with a lower interest rate, and let that man keep on farming instead of trying to throw him out with foreclosure and sell his land out from under him. That's the modified kind of Jubilee that we're going to have one way or the other to get us out of the economic problems we're in.
Thank you. To my colleague, Mr. Kent.
Hello, Pat.
Yeah, hello. It's nice to be here. And this is probably unfair because I know you're the one Republican candidate that said you don't worship at the altar of a balanced budget. We also are talking about additions. We haven't seen the cuts that we really need to get there. I like to rib you a bit about the fact that I have a better fiscal conservative rating than you do in the Congress when it comes to voting on spending items. I know we'll go different ways.
Trying to ruin my day, Pat?
Well, and I know, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, the Democrats tax and spend, but I must say borrowing and spending isn't any better. In fact, I think it's worse, and it's really immoral what we're doing to our children by continuing this. So we haven't grown out of the deficit. What would you cut? Where would you go, and how would you start to get this deficit under control?
Well, Pat, first of all, the one rating in which you have done better is the National Taxpayers Union. They consider voting for defense to be anti-taxpayer. It's a libertarian group and believe that voting for defense, I've always voted for defense, will continue to vote for defense, notwithstanding the fact that on that one rating it makes me look like I'm a spender. I am a spender for the defense of this country because I believe in peace, but through strength. And I'm not a hawk, I'm a dove, heavily armed, but a dove. Now, there's only one answer to debt. There's only one answer to debt, either for a family, a farmer, a businessman or woman, or a country, and that's growth, more income. So a freeze on spending for 1 year, other than national security or social security, a line item veto that most of us agree on, more growth, lower unemployment, Pat, and certainly lower interest rates. We're spending $150 billion a year servicing debt. I think the rates are probably in the range of 9 and 9.5% servicing that debt. They're higher than they were in the Civil War, making the dollar sound and honest and stable again, making it as good as gold, bring interest rates down. We could reduce the debt service of this country by $80 billion to $90 billion a year. I think that'd be good not only for the deficit, but farmers in Iowa and throughout this country.
Mr. Hague, you've had a lot of experience in the executive branch, and again, let me say you're the only Republican candidate that I've been able to find out that's been willing to characterize the deficit problem as a Republican problem. I salute your courage on this. And I also
I'll correct that in a moment, Pat.
Well, I also want to say, I think you also know that since the president writes the first budget, there's no constitutional thing saying it must be imbalanced. They can put anything in or take anything out. So again, I would ask you the question, what would you do about the deficit if you're elected, and how would you really start to wrestle that bear to the ground?
Right. Well, incidentally, I didn't blame it on the Republican Party, but the Democratic House as well for their budget-busting proposals. On the other hand, if you don't know where the deficit came from, it's very difficult to know how to reduce it. It came from two directly contrary schools of economic theory applied simultaneously. Supply side of growth theory, Jack's, monetarism, Paul Volcker's theory, tight money, high interest to squeeze inflation out of the economy, was like putting the engine in first gear and reverse at the same time, and the grinding you heard was the mounting national debt. Now, line item veto, of course. We're really talking about 3 to 4% reduction per year in the growth of our federal budget. We're not talking about gutting existing social contract programs. And that seems to me a very simple thing to do with discipline instead of the kind of disaster this recent budget compromise was. A real $9 billion tax increase and a smoke and mirrors reduction of things that are never going to happen. We are going to have to get some courage on this deficit, and if we don't do it even before 1988, we're going to find the rest of the world losing confidence. We're going to find our dollar continuing to fall despite all the liquidity pumped into the system and all of the help from our allies. We've got to cut across the board. Defense,
time's up.
Everything.
Finally, Senator Dole. I want to say that I was very moved by your goals that you stated at the beginning and how you wanted to make the party more compassionate. Those would be your goals as you went. And of course, all that costs money. And I must say, you and Vice President Bush have probably been the two closest to this deficit because you're the closest to the administration and the one whose phone calls probably got returned the quickest. Let me ask you what you think, as you helped engineer a lot of Reaganomics by getting it through the Senate, about the recent Congressional Budget Office report showing that what's really happened is the tax rate is now lower on rich people than it was in 1977, and it's higher on poor people than it was in 1977. How does that fit the goals of what you want to do as president, and would you change some of the things that you had put through?
Well, let me first state, Pat, we're happy to have you here. Keep in mind that the 1986 Tax Reform Act, if that isn't a fact, I haven't read that CBO report, it means Congressional Budget Office, was a bipartisan effort. It was forged by a House Ways and Means Committee controlled heavily by Democrats and a Senate Finance Committee controlled by a couple of votes by Republicans. So it's a bipartisan effort. And I believe the Tax Reform Act was good policy. We lowered tax rates. We want to continue to lower tax rates. But I think we have to face up. You know, we haven't talked many specifics here tonight. We've all sort of danced around the issues and said what we were against and what we were for. I'm for line item veto, not raising tax rates, balanced budget amendment. But whoever's elected president is going to have a tough job. And I think we just have to grab the bull by the horns and tell the American people, and they'll follow us if we provide leadership, that we're going to freeze spending for a year. No exceptions except low-income Americans, whether they be on Social Security or WIC program or food stamps. And if we do that, we'll get about $19 billion savings the first year, $80 the second year, $156 billion in real savings, no smoke and mirrors over a 3-year period.
Well, thank you very much. And as I say, we're still looking for what you would all line item veto, but let me move to the next page.
I'll tell you what I would.
I didn't get asked.
I think we've got to move on to the next page, but I think that that's a very, you're right, that's true, Vice President. The next part that I have heard lots of Americans be very concerned about is that we've all been raised saying America is a government of laws and not of men. And that we have been very, very proud of the fact that we have had a government of laws, that we've had very high standards, that our public service has never been corrupt, and we have seen a decline of ethics and standards in a lot of different places. More and more people think that Washington's looking like a coin-operated machine rather than the type of process we would like to see and that we are celebrating here as we celebrate democracy tonight on this stage. So let me start with you, Mr. DuPont. We have seen more than 100 political appointees of the Reagan administration forced from office under an ethical cloud of one sort or another. That concerns me, that there appears to be a real disregard for the public trust. Does this bother you? I know you ran an office. Are the standards too high? What is our problem?
It does bother me, Pat. And the biggest example of, and the most recent example of sleaze was Ted Kennedy putting a bill through in the middle of the night in the budget bill to make someone sell a newspaper without hearings, without any process at all. 10 Democratic congressmen are under investigation by the House Ethics Committee. The Speaker of the House, Jim Wright, a Democrat, has had charges placed against, or not placed against, but charges made in the press about his ethical dealings. And there's a problem in Washington, all right, and it's there. I want to tell you that when I became governor, I accomplished something in the first half an hour that I tried in 6 years as a congressman to accomplish, and that was sign an executive order requiring financial disclosure by judges and cabinet secretaries and everybody I appointed. I fired a cabinet secretary once because he wasn't running the prisons properly. I had an investigation. I took prompt action. We set an ethical standard in Delaware that was extremely high while I was governor. I'll set the same standard as president when I get to Washington.
Thank you very much. Vice President Bush, I'm sure that these clouds have concerned you a lot too, and there's been an awful lot of concern about Attorney General Meese and some of the judicial appointees. If you are reelected, would you keep Attorney General Meese in office, and would you continue down, or would there be a way that we could turn around on some of these ethical violations? I think you should set a standard for the Congress.
Absolutely. I've said I'd have a total change. It has nothing to do with Ed Meese in terms of revitalization of the process, bring new people in. That's a good thing to do. Secondly, I like what Pete said. I favor full disclosure. Way back in 1968, I kind of led a band of freshman congressmen for it. And I'd like to suggest here tonight that every one of us lay out not these forms that you fill out in Congress that says I have assets between $50 and $250 million, 50,000, but that lay out your tax returns. I think we all ought to do it for 10 years back, now and 10 years back. I don't like the idea because I think it's an invasion of privacy, but we're at a different level now. And we should set that example for the American people. And I hope that all of us sitting here on the stage will do it, and I think that would be a good thing. And the last point, Pat, is this. It's fine to accuse 100 people of being driven out, but do you remember one of them, Ray Donovan? Convicted in the press, convicted by the political leaders, and he went to trial. He was acquitted, and he came out and he said, what office do I go to get my good name back? We're a country of fair play.
Okay. So is John Zucaro, and I think that's true. That's really a problem.
Good answer.
I think Geraldine Ferraro would agree with you.
No, I think that's right.
That a lot of it gets way out of hand, but we still
I told Geraldine I didn't like what was happening to her and her family long before the final verdict was out, and I didn't. Politics should transcend that kind of thing.
And let me ask you, Mr. Robertson, I started out by saying that this is a government of laws and not of men. And I found a statement of yours made in 1986 where you said as president you would not be bound by Supreme Court decisions with which you disagreed because you didn't feel they were the law of the land. Was that a misinterpretation, or?
No, Pat. I went to Yale Law School instead of Harvard, and we learned better constitutional law. But it's always been a concept that a judge decides a case before him that is brought by two litigants, and that decision primarily binds those parties, and then with the Supreme Court it obviously is binding throughout the federal judiciary system and should be given enormous credibility in relation to the other branches of government. But we have a government set up of checks and balances. We have a Congress that, in my estimation, is the most powerful branch of the government. We have a chief executive, and we have a judiciary system. And the thing that has appalled me is that the Supreme Court has taken on itself the role of the legislature. And I, of course, would respect their rulings and decisions, but the Constitution says the law of the land has to do with the Constitution, laws duly enacted by Congress, and treaties, and not Supreme Court decisions. And I just want to follow the Constitution. But furthermore, I want to appoint judges who feel it's the task of a judge to interpret the Constitution and the law, not try to rewrite them.
Thank you. Mr. Kemp, you've always been very ethical in our foreign policies, too, standing up for human rights and every other such thing, and you've been a very strong supporter of Israel. Do you support what we are doing now in the Palestinian conflict, in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Are we doing the right thing?
What we're doing?
Yes, the United States.
Well, Pat, it is a terrible problem, notwithstanding the vote in the UN. We have to recognize that the United Nations is not only hostile to the United States, it's hostile to Israel. They passed a resolution a number of years ago where they said that Zionism is racism. That's never been repealed. The Soviet Union 6 months ago voted to expel Israel from the United Nations. So I don't favor putting policy in front of the United Nations when it comes to the United States supporting its friends, whether it's Taiwan or Israel or any tiny little country that needs a good friend. Number two, the Palestinian problem is a problem that has been vexing to that part of the world for a long time. When Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip and when Jordan controlled the West Bank, they did nothing to solve that Palestinian problem. I think we should be not tolerant of mistakes, but tolerant of our friends who have very tough problems, and I would have vetoed in the UN any attack on Israel for trying to deal with a problem that I think has been exacerbated by terrorists like the PLO.
Mr. Haig, I think one of the great tragedies has been a lot of defense contractors seem to think that pro-defense administrations can be ripped off for excessive profits and shoddy materials. We've had the Grace Commission, the Packard Commission, we've tried a new Pentagon procurement system, and we can't even keep the job of the Assistant Secretary for Procurement there. I know that when you left office, you went to work for a defense contractor, and things are usually a little better on that side. Do you think we should continue that type of revolving door? Do you think that there is any way that if you got re-elected, or if you got elected, that the defense contractors wouldn't be singing happy days are here again?
Well, Pat, first, I didn't go to work for a defense contractor. I was president of a company that did 60% of its business in the commercial side and 40% defense contracting. And I'm not one that goes around the country accusing everyone in the defense industry of being some kind of a crook. It's just simply not true. Now, secondly, let me say, it takes a graduate of that five-sided puzzle palace to understand some of the problems. The first order of business is to get a manager. I would pick a man like Bill Simon and say, Bill, give me a year of your time, get in there and clean that mess out. Dave Packard came in a late period of his life and did a very, very substantial study on procurement in the Pentagon and a host of other reforms, which sits now languishing on the desk of the Secretary of Defense without implementation, and that's a disgrace. No, this is a major, major problem facing our next president, to clean up that boar's nest. And let me tell you, as one who knows it, I'd do it.
Glad to hear it. And Senator Dole, let me say I think campaign financing has become a really major, major issue. And this year you led a filibuster that kept the Senate from voting on legislation that would limit spending in Senate elections and also cut political action committee contributions by 2/3. Now, Goldwater had backed this before he retired. I think many people think it's a good idea. Even the Des Moines Register endorsed this, if you can believe it, saying how much more sleazy does campaign financing have to be before the Congress acts? Why wouldn't you let it come to a vote? Why did you lead the filibuster? And as President of the United States, would you continue to have the same opinion about campaign finance reform?
No, I feel very strongly about campaign finance reform and have said so and introduced legislation to do it. But I think we're getting a lot of these liberal democratic questions thrown at us, and I think we have to address them. It's not campaign reform. In 1986, the Democrats talked about campaign reform, limiting the amount political action committees could give to candidates. But in 1987, they took back the Senate, they didn't change the PAC contribution. Still $5,000 for each election cycle. $5,000 for the primary, $5,000 for the general. So that's one. It's not campaign reform. It doesn't even cut PAC spending. Secondly, it's public financing, which I think is wrong for 535 Senate and House races. And thirdly, I'm a Republican. You know, I want the Republican Party to grow. And this bill put a cap on how much you could spend for Senate races. It's an Incumbents Protection Act. In the South, where Republicans are outnumbered 8 to 1, 4 to 1, 10 to 1, you put a limit on how much a Republican candidate to spend, and the South's going to be Democratic forever. So it was a Democratic incumbent in perpetuity bill, and we're not going to pass it. But we're for campaign reform.
We need quick questions and quick answers on this last round.
All right. Mr. DuPont, when we served together in the House, you were one of my good friends and one of the Republicans I respected very much. You had a good, strong, moderate voting record. What happened?
Yeah, what happened?
Unlike people who serve in the Congress, Pat, I went home and became a governor and had to learn to lead. And when you learn to lead, you know things have to work. They don't just have to sound good. And the budget has to balance. It just doesn't have to sound good to people in one congressional district in Colorado or anywhere else. You learn you've got to put forward proposals that'll increase opportunity for people, like cutting taxes in our state 30% for every family, and thereby increasing jobs by 20% for every family. I really don't know, but a lot of people and Democrats in the Congress don't like tax cuts. They think people ought to pay more just because it's good for them. You know, if you cut taxes, you create growth, and that creates opportunity. I learned that in leading as a governor. That's why I'm a better person today than when I was a congressman.
Vice President Bush. Vice President Bush, I have saluted your courage in standing up among these candidates and supporting family planning policy. You have done a very good job long-term, both internationally and nationally. I must say I was a little disappointed recently when the AID programs were cut back so they could only back programs that push the rhythm system abroad, which isn't the best family planning policy ever. I was sorry to see your thumbprints on that, but I assume that you will go back to the family planning policies that you have stood so stoutly for throughout your career.
I support international family planning, and I support family planning. I don't support abortion, and as you know, I'm opposed to that. So I don't know what fingerprints you're talking about, but it's not my understanding that that is the only method. I think you better go back and look at the legislation, unless I'm mistaken.
Well, my understanding was that it had severely limited
I think what it did was to permit another method of family planning that was related to rhythm, which had heretofore been precluded. But I think that ought to be checked.
Yeah, you're right.
Let me now move to Mr. Robertson, because I wish we could get into great debates on all these issues. Unfortunately, the time clock keeps running. I was sure glad to hear you say that you would have women in your cabinet, because I ran across another statement that you had made where you said,
You've done some great research.
Quote,
I want to commend you for it.
I know this is painful for you ladies to hear, but if you get married and you've accepted the headship of a man, your husband is the head of the household, and the husband's head is the head of the wife, and that's the way it is. If that's your religious belief, I respect that, but I would not want to see that implemented in government, so I was relieved to hear that you probably wouldn't.
This is a debate to choose the next president of the United States, and I think the relationship between a man and his wife is based on a very, very private, sacred relationship between the two of them. And I'm a Republican. I don't favor the federal government getting involved in anybody's marriage relationship, certainly not as president or any other way.
Nor do I, sir, but you would be president of all the people, including women.
I would be the president of all women, and I would think that a man and his wife, I cannot imagine the intrusion of the federal government into such a private relationship. I'm amazed it's even brought up.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you would not bring it into the public sector. Mr. Kemp, you have been very strong in talking about the American family, and as we know, the American dream of car, home, college, kids, all of those that we want for everybody are costing more and more and more. And Our country, compared to other countries in the world, have done very little. Almost every other industrialized country has done more on child care, on family medical leave, and so forth. Many of us are pushing legislation on that in the House, and we miss your name. What do you do realistically for the government, for the American family?
Well, one of the reasons you miss my name is some of the things that you've been talking about, Pat, were implemented both in '81 and in '86. I believe we need to take it further. We ought to totally remove the marriage penalty tax. We should totally abolish the estate tax on those women, those small family farms, those small family businesses, and that was part of the '81 tax cut, and that had a magnificent impact upon widows who heretofore had to sell off a farm or sell off property or sell off a home in order to survive. We increased the dependent exemption from $1,000 to $2,000. Dr. James Dobson, one of the leading authorities of Focus on the Family, suggested that was the most important tax reform of the last 25 years. We increased the home care and the child care tax credit to $720. I'm a strong supporter of that. I don't want to discriminate against a woman who in a home raises her own children, so I think we ought to expand it. But I don't believe in unisex insurance because, frankly, Pat, I think it would raise the cost of insurance for autos and life insurance for women, and I think that would be discriminatory.
Mr. Haig, if the Russians are to test and deploy depressed trajectory missiles, they would be able to slip underneath the Star Wars shield and wipe out our strategic bombers before they could take off. Democratic candidates seem to be supporting a bilateral ballistic flight test ban on both sides to keep the Russians from trying to do this breakout and maybe having a nuclear Pearl Harbor. Would you support that? And if you don't support that type of a bilateral flight test ban, how would you propose to protect Star Wars?
Well, first, Pat, I'm not familiar with that bill, and I don't want to portray myself as an expert on it. It's very clear that the whole issue of Star Wars is an issue which is going to be at the centerpiece of the START discussions. It already is racking the hill. I'm very, very leery of thinking we can legislate through bans of the kind you suggest the solutions to problems that we're unwilling to face in our defense spending and in our strategic concepts. The real problem that we face today is a weakness in our strategic inventory, which gives the Soviets about a 3-to-1 first strike capability today. The new START proposals, as I read the recent communique signed with Mr. Gorbachev, could threaten to aggravate that to a level of perhaps 5-to-1. So strategic defense has become more important, perhaps more than it should have, because of our failure to deal with our counterforce capability. But I'd have to study this.
Okay. And Senator Dole, on the firing line debate, I was moved by your saying that you would hang Lincoln's picture in the Oval Office because he abolished slavery and saved the Union. Indeed, that is one of the strong heritages of the Republican Party, which I salute and think is wonderful. But how do you reconcile that with opposing sanctions against South Africa on apartheid when you've also supported sanctions against other countries? Apartheid was our slavery. I think this is a great moral issue for this country. And as president, would you continue to turn your head to what's going on in South Africa?
Well, if I were president, I might have a little different view of that, but I must say as a Republican leader, when Ronald Reagan vetoed that bill, and keep in mind that President Reagan was willing to do everything except one thing requested in that bill. He would have done it by executive order. There wasn't any need to pass it. In an effort to embarrass the president, I fought to sustain the veto. Apartheid's repugnant. None of us believe in that. We all agree that it's repugnant. We'd all try to change it. We want to preserve the jobs for black people in South Africa. We're opposed to discrimination. I've been very fortunate in Congress to lead the charge for the Voting Rights Bill, for the King Holiday Bill. I've got a perfect civil rights record, and I'm very proud of it. I even had a letter in my file from Coretta Scott King saying she'd support me in my 1986 re-election for the Senate. I haven't talked to her about this new thing I'm doing, but So I feel all right about my record, and I sleep well at night.
Thank you, Senator Dole. Thank you, Congresswoman Schroeder. That completes that round of questioning, and now it's time for the closing statements. To keep this on time, I'm going to ask you gentlemen to limit yourself, please, to 2 minutes, and we will begin now with Senator Dole.
Thank you very much. First, I want to ask the voters of Iowa, those in the audience and those who are viewing, to support me in the caucus on February 8th. I said at the outset I come from a small town, I have small town traditional values, and I have experience. I've said all over this state, in all 99 counties where Elizabeth and I have traveled, that I've made a difference. I've demonstrated that I've made a difference. I have a record. I have honesty and integrity and credibility. But I've made a difference on tax reform. Tax indexing, for example, is the best thing we've done. I've made a difference on Social Security, saving Social Security. I've made a difference on voting rights. Oh yes, I made a difference for farmers in this state with the '85 Farm Bill, a market-oriented farm bill. I was in Sibley, Iowa, a while back, and I had a 7-year-old boy said, Bob, or Senator Dole, I guess he said, what's it going to be like if you get elected? It was Bob after my answer, but in any event, I looked at that young man who's going to be voting for his first time in the year 2000. And I thought very hard about the answer. And what I want for America and for that young man is a better opportunity for jobs, yes, education, freedom, whatever goes with it, and security. Security in the family, security in their job, security as a country. And if I'm fortunate enough to win the caucuses in this state, I want to get on that plane that night and go to the next state. And I want to think to myself when I'm on board that the people of Iowa looked at this guy from Kansas who came from a poor background, made it the hard way, just like many in Iowa did. And they said to themselves that, you know, Bob Dole he's one of us. And that's why he won the caucus in Iowa.
Thank you.
Well, first, let me say I'm very proud to be with this group of distinguished Americans who unquestionably, each and every one, is qualified to lead this country in normal times. But let me suggest these are not normal times. Indeed, business as usual in the White House will not be tolerable. First, because America as a nation, in relative terms, no longer has the demographic assets that enable us to survive incompetence, malfeasance, less than perfection in the conduct of our affairs. Secondly, because as a nation, we're now facing whether or not America will continue on with this renaissance of the spirit, this Reagan revolution, which I believe is essential, or turn to Pat and her colleagues for a return to the Malthusian, self-flagellating, self-depreciating attitudes of the 70s. I hope that doesn't happen. But we have a deficit of unprecedented proportion. We have a Soviet leader of unparalleled competence in Moscow. We need a president in 1988 who knows American government, has served in the executive branch and exercised executive authority. We need a president who knows America, who served in the private sector, in large multinational corporation, and built a small business of his own. We need a president who knows the world, who's respected by foreign leaders, friend and foe. We need a president who knows how critical it is to avoid war, and only one who's seen it on 2 occasions knows its dangers. Finally, we above all need a president who can sit across the table from Mr. Gorbachev and match him every step of the way. Thank you.
Congressman Kemp.
Our party was founded as a party by Mr. Lincoln as a freedom party, party of hope, party of emancipation, a party of liberation. It was a party that offered any man, any woman, of any color, of any creed, of any ethnic or socio-economic background, the opportunity to be what God meant them to be. Here was the one place on this earth from which any boy or girl could rise to the highest of their ability based upon merit. We went through a civil war, we went through a civil rights revolution to guarantee that those rights were available to all people. I'm very proud that the Republican Party not only played a strong role in helping create that type of an America, but has continually worked for reform to make it better. 212 years ago, Thomas Jefferson said, "The same God who gave us life gave us freedom." Those are the inalienable rights. He didn't write those words for one people, but for all people. Didn't write them just for whites, but for all Americans, and not just for one generation, but all generations. And if you travel around the world, I believe people all over this world have two homelands, their own and the United States. This is the only country on this earth in which people riot to stay in our prison camps to prevent themselves from being sent to a communist prison camp 90 miles off the coast of Cuba. Keeping this country strong, keeping peace by making our defense secure, by bringing prosperity without inflation to every corner of this country, and then exporting that to the rest of the world. Seems to me that to be an American is to be special without being ostentatious. It means caring about the world. It means caring about exporting democracy and capitalism to the rest of this waiting world. And it seems to me it means most of all having a president who challenged us to be the best people we can be, to help put in place a country that I think our founding fathers and mothers wanted it to be, a nation that serves as an example, not for just this time, for all time to come. I think that's what Mr. Lincoln wanted from the Republican Party, and of all the candidates, I really believe that my candidacy gives us the best chance in our lifetime of broadening the base of our party and moving this country forward to those high ideals of peace and prosperity for all. Thank you.
Mr. Robertson.
I believe through the next decade, America is going to be faced with some incredible challenges. We have a trade deficit which is unprecedented. We have a federal debt which is now at $2.3+ trillion and moving up toward $3 trillion. We have a runaway federal budget deficit. Underlying that, though, we have moral problems in our country. We have the breakup of the American family. Half of all the marriages ending in divorce. We have 1 million runaway teenagers each year. We have a drug epidemic, a crime epidemic, and now an AIDS epidemic. We have an educational system which used to be the greatest in the world, and it's failing. We've got problems in the farms and manufacturing. We are the greatest nation on the face of the earth. The question is, what vision is going to move us into the 21st century? Are we going to have a vision of faith? Are we going to have a vision of freedom? Are we going to have a vision of self-reliance? Will we get back to those fundamental principles on which our founding fathers laid the foundation for the greatest nation that has ever been in the world's history? Now, we've heard many people talk about their experiences in Congress and in government. With all due deference to all of my distinguished colleagues, I think the Congress and the government leaders have made pretty much a mess of things in the last 20 years. And in my experience, I took $70 and over the few years built up a complex of companies in the private sector that had about $230 million a year in income. I'm used to being goal-oriented. I don't have the privilege of either raising taxes or running a deficit. I've got to balance my budget or else I go broke. I know what it's like to meet a payroll. I know what it's like to have people's lives dependent on me. I know what it's like to make the hard executive decisions. I've been the chief executive officer for 25 years. But beyond that, I know what it is to be compassionate because I've walked the streets of the big cities. I've seen the poor, the blacks, the needy, those who we must reach out to with compassion. And I offer this nation a vision of greatness during the next decade that will take us into the next century. Thank you very much.
Mr. Vice President.
We're about to We're participating in a part of the process that leads to choosing a president. Iowa's important. But we're a great country. We've earned our optimism. We've earned the right to be confident. But we have an unfulfilled agenda. And I want to lead the country to the fulfillment of the agenda. I think people want broad experience, and I've had it fighting for my country in combat, building a business so I know what it is to meet a payroll, running the intelligence community, serving in a foreign country, communist China, and seeing there, coming back, counting the blessings for the freedoms that I theretofore had taken for granted. Served at the United Nations and then been vice president for 7 years. On vision, you have to have a vision. Mine is that education should be the #1 thing. Better education means better jobs. I want to be the president that wrestles the deficit to the ground. I want to be the president because I believe in public service. My dad believed in it. We've had honorable lives in public service that hold high the highest ethical standard. And I want to be the president that's not afraid to reach out for peace. Keep this country strong. Know enough about it so you'd know how to deal with the Soviet leaders or the Chinese or whoever it is, but don't be afraid to take a step for peace. When people go into that voting booth or to the caucus, they're going to be saying, who has the values we believe in? Who has the experience we trust? Who has the stability, the integrity to get the job done? I'm that man. I ask for your support.
Mr. DuPont, please. Mr. DuPont.
Well, you've heard from all of us tonight, and I'm proud of the choice that the Republican Party is giving to the people of this country. History says that one of us is going to be president because 4 of the last 5 times the American people have picked a Republican. But which one? Well, if you want a Washington insider, you might choose George Bush. He's held practically every job there. If you want a congressional negotiator, you might pick Bob Dole. If you want somebody to lead who's led a government and nobody else on this platform has, somebody who's put forward a set of proposals to lead America where all of us understand it needs to go, well, I'd like your consideration on caucus night, because I think the Pete DuPont campaign has put forward proposals that'll push more opportunity into your kitchen. This election's very simple. How do we make your family better off in the 1990s than you were in the 1980s? How do we help you steer your kids away from drugs and towards opportunity? How do we help you get a better education for your son or daughter? How do we make you and your spouse more secure in your retirement? Those are the questions of this election, and we've offered some answers. Now, maybe you feel everything in America is just fine the way it is. The drugs are an alternative lifestyle a youngster ought to be able to choose. That we can ignore the ticking time bomb of the Social Security system. That we can keep on spending $23 billion a year on agricultural subsidies. That a failed welfare system trapping poor people in poverty is something too politically sensitive to deal with. That we can educate youngsters for the next century with a system designed in the last. Well, if you feel that, one of these other gentlemen may be fine for you as a president of the United States, but if you believe America can do more, I want you to remember tonight that I do too. If you believe America can do better, together, taking the opportunity that's here in these caucuses, we can make it come to pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen. I want to thank Congresswoman Schroeder for being with us tonight. I want to thank all of you gentlemen very sincerely on behalf of the Des Moines Register, all the people of Iowa for participating in this debate. I'm sure the people of Iowa have watched and listened with great interest. A month from now you'll know the verdict, and until then the jury is out. So from the Civic Center in Des Moines, Iowa, I'm James P. Gannon saying thank you, see you next Friday, and good night.